Before we delve into today's story, you need to know about OGL, or Open Game License. As detailed here by Roll20, the OGL license grants permission to copy, modify, and distribute the files collectively known as the System Reference Document 5.1, or SRD5. It is granted solely through the use of the Open Gaming License version 1.0. This is a license that essentially says you can take aspects of Dungeons & Dragons system and create your own content around it, be it your own stories, your own world, your own modules, your own classes, and whatnot, and you can commercially sell them. We've seen plenty of cool Kickstarters surrounding Dungeons & Dragons, unique content created by the community. We've seen major organizations like Critical Role do their own stuff and sell their own things based on the D&D world. And what this OGL license has done is fostered a community that's fueled by creativity, and that's given rise to Dungeons & Dragons in the past couple of years. It's allowed for just a lot of creative flow that has driven momentum for Dungeons & Dragons and tabletop as a whole. But all of that stands to be compromised based on reports indicating that Wizards of the Coast, the company behind Dungeons & Dragons, are planning to update the OGL in a way that will be a lot more restrictive and that will essentially try to exert more control over community content so that they can do whatever they want with that content, and they also get a little bit of a pay cut from community content. Something else you need to understand before we dive into further details is the state of Wizards of the Coast and its parent company, Hasbro. Something rather unnerving happened back in December of 2022 when Wizards of the Coast CEO said that he believes the hobby of Dungeons & Dragons is under-monetized compared to video games, and that he desires for the type of recurrent spending you see in digital games. Meaning the CEO wants to essentially replicate and emulate what video games do with microtransactions, or I should call them macro transactions, as a means of recurrent monetization for tabletop gaming and for Dungeons & Dragons, which is just an awful model that has severely compromised the artistic integrity of many of today's AAA games. We certainly don't want to see that seep into tabletop gaming. And then on top of that, earlier this month, on January 3rd, 2023, Bloomberg reported that Hasbro's Wizards of the Coast canceled a bunch of video game projects. They canceled at least 5 video game projects as it scales back its ambitions in the industry, and that's in large part because Hasbro's found itself in some financial troubles. This comes alongside financial difficulties at Hasbro, whose shares fell 40% last year as higher prices led to lower toy sales. And so there are questions and speculation as to whether Hasbro's recent financial troubles has something to do with the way the Open Game License for Dungeons & Dragons is being updated in such a way that seeks to exert more control and profit off of community content. Now, back in December 21st, 2022, it was assured by Wizards of the Coast that for creators, if you're making commercial content, relatively little is going to change for most creators. For most of you who are selling custom content, here are the new things you'll need to do. 1, accept the license terms and let us know what you're offering for sale. Number 2, report OGL-related revenue annually if you make more than $50,000 in a year. And 3, include a creator product badge on your work. So already they're outlining a number of restrictions and extra processes that weren't a part of the original OGL. And then things start to get egregious here. For the fewer than 20 creators worldwide who make more than $750,000 in income a year, we will add a royalty starting in 2024. No royalties will be due for 2023, and all revenue below $750,000 in future years will be royalty-free. Now, what they don't tell you here is the exact percentage that's due to those who make more than $750,000 off of the new updated OGL. We'll get to that in a bit. But the bottom line that Wizards of the Coast assured is that the OGL is not going away. You'll still be able to create new D&D content, publish it anywhere, and game with your friends and followers in all the ways that make this gaming community so great. But a recent report by journalist Linda Codega, who published this article right here on io9/Gizmodo, tells a completely different story. Here's how Linda summarized it. Yesterday, I received the full text of the OGL 1.1 from a reputable source. The updated Open Gaming License is incredibly restrictive, demands community surveillance, and, most importantly, renders the previous Wizards of the Coast OGL an unauthorized agreement. What was once a license that encouraged creative freedom and fueled the Dungeons & Dragons and tabletop community is seemingly going to become both a leash and a milking device. But you know what is a great fuel and uses milk in a positive way? The sponsor of today's video, Magic Spoon, a company that specializes in cereals that are both flavorsome, and also help fuel your diet. What makes Magic Spoon stand out is how it contains high amounts of protein, roughly 13 grams per serving, with none of the detrimental ingredients. We're talking 0 grams of sugar, 0 gluten, 0 grains like wheat, rice, and soy, and 0 artificial flavorings or sweeteners. Magic Spoon is also keto-friendly with only 4 to 5 net grams of carbs per serving. As someone who's aiming to get back to working out, losing fat, and building some extra muscle in the new year, this cereal makes for a great breakfast or snack. Best part is, these actually taste pretty good. I tried 4 unique flavors: fruity, frosted, chocolate, and peanut butter, each quite distinct and tasty, but my favorite has got to be the fruity flavor. The fruitiness of each bite was subtle, with just the right amount of sugarless sweetness accentuated by a creamy aftertaste. I ended up liking it a lot more than I anticipated. I genuinely foresee myself enjoying eating this on the daily, both to enhance my diet before or after workouts and to fulfill my occasional cravings throughout the day. If flavorful and protein-fueled cereal sounds like it's up your alley, you can use my promo code YONGYEAH or use the link magicspoon.com/YONGYEAH to get $5 off on any order. And if for whatever reason you don't end up liking it, Magic Spoon guarantees a full refund, no questions asked. So, hey, it won't hurt to give it a try. Unlike what Wizards of the Coast is seemingly trying to attempt with OGL 1.1, which will hurt the community. So let's delve into the Gizmodo article in question, titled Dungeons & Dragons New License Tightens Its Grip on Competition. An exclusive look at Wizards of the Coast's new open gaming license shows efforts to curtail competitors and tighten control on creators of all sizes. This article was published on January 5th, and what it outlines definitely paints a rather dire picture. It begins by stating that despite reassurances from Wizards of the Coast last month, referring to the post published on D&D Beyond where they assure that OGL is not going away, it's not going to be too impactful for creators. The Gizmodo article reports that the original OGL would become an unauthorized agreement, and it appears no new content will be permitted to be created under the original license. There's a clause in OGL 1.1 that says that OGL 1.0 is completely moot. The article then describes the benefits of the original OGL, which is what many contemporary tabletop publishers use to create their products within the boundaries of D&D's reproducible content. There were some restrictions with the original OGL, but they were all within reason, allowed a host of outside designers and publishers, both amateur and professional, to make new products for a game that remains entirely owned by Hasbro subsidiary Wizards of the Coast, and it allowed the game to flourish and grow thanks to the resources created by the wider D&D community. Wizards of the Coast by itself doesn't output enough D&D content. The community is what's allowed D&D to constantly remain fresh, and many would argue that the community has created some of the most compelling content, even compared to what Wizards of the Coast has officially produced. Stuff like that is what OGL 1.0 has allowed, and it is a big part of why D&D has been thriving so much these past few years. The original OGL 1.0 had essentially remained intact until the company said it would develop OGL version 1.1. So what is OGL 1.1? Well, to give you an idea for just how much more restrictive it is, it's worth noting that OGL 1.0 was just under 900 words long, whereas OGL 1.1 is over 9,000 words long. Making community content just got a whole lot more complicated. Now, the article here makes it a point to highlight that the new OGL addresses new technologies like blockchain and NFTs. Wizards of the Coast says they want to mitigate sales of NFTs based off of D&D and stuff like that, and they also want to take a strong stance against bigoted content. Tackling those kinds of issues, that's great, but if you cast such a wide net on an issue that it starts to negatively impact your community, then that's where things go downhill. It is highlighted here that one of the biggest changes is that OGL 1.0 will be considered no longer an authorized license agreement after 1.1 is released. Many licensed publishers will have to completely overhaul their products and distribution in order to comply with the updated rules. One of the quotes highlighted by this report from OGL 1.1 is that OGL wasn't intended to subsidize major competitors, OGL wasn't intended to fund major competitors, and it wasn't intended to allow people to make D&D apps, videos, or anything other than printed or printable materials for use while gaming. We're updating the OGL in part to make that very clear. That's a bunch of types of community content from which a lot of cool stuff has come out of that they're now trying to severely restrict. To further highlight the difference between 1.0 and 1.1, the original OGL granted perpetual worldwide non-exclusive license to the open game content, commonly called the System Resource Document, and directed that licensees may use any authorized version of this license to copy, modify, and distribute any open game content originally distributed under any version of this license. But all of that is null and void. The article then talks about who OGL 1.1 will affect, and it's basically everyone. Every single single licensed publisher will be affected by the new agreement. The updated license only allows for creation of role-playing games and supplements in printed media and static electronic file formats. It does not allow for anything else, including but not limited to things like videos, virtual tabletops. We're talking about Roll20, Tabletop Simulator, you name it, some great tools, or virtual tabletop campaigns, computer games, novels, apps, graphics novels, music, songs, dances, and pantomimes. You may engage in these activities only to the extent allowed under the Wizards of the Coast fan content policy or separately agreed between you and us. I have to wonder how organizations like Critical Role will be impacted by this. No doubt, Critical Role is such a marquee part of Dungeons & Dragons now that they're probably going to get a good deal, but I have to wonder whether under these circumstances, something like Critical Role could ever become as big as it has now. You know what I mean? Could Critical Role have thrived if 1.1 was in place rather than 1.0 when Critical Role first kickstarted? Or at the very least, would they have been a lot more financially constrained or more restricted in the things that they could explore? And that's a larger organization. For the smaller or medium-sized organizations and creators of Dungeons & Dragons content and whatnot, I mean, they're especially going to be negatively impacted by this. The article also reports that Wizards of the Coast didn't plan to give folks a whole lot of time to decide whether they want to shift over to the new license, agree to the new OGL. The final version of the document was originally intended for release on January 4th, and companies, organizations, and creators would have had until January 13th, 2023 to decide whether they want to sign the new OGL license, whether they want to agree to those terms, giving them only 7 business days to agree and comply, which is ridiculous. 7 business days to agree and comply for such a major shift is really not a whole lot of time. OGL 1.1 also has some rules and regulations in place for people who make money off of D&D mods, essentially, or D&D custom community content. Now, if your content is available in a way that it's free, but people can tip you or support you on something like Patreon, then you're going to be considered non-commercial because the product itself is free and out there. The money that you're taking is from people volunteering to give you money rather than them having to pay in order to obtain the custom D&D product. As for the rest who are making money off of custom-made D&D content, you're going to fall under one of 3 tiers. There's the Initiate tier for those making less than $50,000 in revenue in a given year. There's the Intermediate tier for those making between $50,000 and $750,000 in a given year in revenue, by the way, not profit, revenue. This is an important point which I'll bring up later. And finally, the Expert tier, which is for those making $750,000 and above in revenue in a given year. The reason I bring up the word revenue and how the word profit is not used is because the new OGL states that the commercial agreement covers all commercial uses, whether they're profitable or not. So if you go into the red on a Kickstarter that earned $800,000 in backing money, you still owe Wizards of the Coast regardless of the fact that you did not profit from your venture. It's an extra tax on top of the money that you're losing because what Wizards of the Coast takes into account is total revenue rather than the net positive earnings that you made. Now, Wizards of the Coast is open to creating custom contracts and agreements, but at their discretion. So depending on how important a certain organization is to their ecosystem, they'll likely give them a better deal, but for competitors like Pathfinder, they might not get a great deal. Now, in terms of royalties you have to pay for those earning $750,000 or above, something I mentioned previously was that Wizards of the Coast didn't detail exact percentages. This report alleges that according to the new OGL, for those who are in the Expert tier, you're responsible for paying Wizards of the Coast 20% or 25% of qualifying revenue. Qualifying revenue refers to anything made after the $750,000 mark. So an example provided here is if you make $750,001, you'll owe Wizards of the Coast 25 cents, essentially 25% of the extra dollar you made after the $750,000 mark. The article then provides a quote from the new OGL, further stipulating processes you have to go through, restrictions that you're now under, no matter what tier you are in or how much money you believe your product will make, you must register with us any new licensed work you intend to offer for sale, including a description of the licensed work. We'll also ask for your contact information, information on where you intend to publish licensed work, and its price, among other things. They want an account of everything. They want to know exactly what's going on at all times. They want very strict surveillance. There are also things like specific badges and labels they have to use to differentiate between official Wizards of the Coast stuff and stuff that was licensed through the new OGL. And then this article makes it a point to highlight that this whole reporting system right here outlined by the article, it feels like an impossible task for smaller organizations. People are selling their work across dozens of platforms, and sometimes one product is being sold on multiple platforms. Whatever the reporting system looks like, the biggest burden will likely be on the smallest creators. Now, one interesting thing to note is that Kickstarter is getting special treatment, whereas the usual royalty you have to pay is 25%. For Kickstarter, the royalty is only 20% on qualifying revenue. The reason this happened is because the director of games at Kickstarter, John Ritter, contacted Wizards of the Coast about this new OGL and essentially negotiated with them to lower the percentage as much as possible because he believed that the best move was to advocate for creators, so he managed to bring down the Kickstarter royalties to 20%. Which, yes, is better than 25%, but 20% is still a huge amount. On top of royalties, there are some strings attached to using any crowdfunding platform as outlined here by the article, such as you may only crowdfund the production of licensed works, and no infringing materials can be given out as perks or rewards. A few final details worth highlighting is that the original OGL contained a clause mentioning perpetual worldwide rights given to creators. That is not present at all in version 1.1, and there is this one clause that makes an already shit cake stink that much worse. One of the caveats is that the company can modify or terminate this agreement for any reason whatsoever, provided we give 30 days notice. At any point, they can decide to change the rules, even if it's to the detriment of the community and to creators, and get away with it. It's starting to feel like Wizards of the Coast has been taking some notes from how YouTube runs things. Oh, and it gets worse. Wizards of the Coast also gets the right to use any content that licensees create, whether commercial or non-commercial. They can take any community-created content, use it as they please, and not have to compensate the actual original creator in any way, shape, or form. They can take all the credit and make all the profit from content that they didn't create, all while screwing over that same community with these new restrictions and rules. How twisted is that? Now, apparently there is a clause in OGL 1.1 that reads, "We're more than open to being convinced that we made a wrong decision." This article perceives that as Wizards of the Coast expecting these OGL changes to be met with some resistance. They probably know that there's going to be backlash. So, let there be backlash. Let them know exactly what you think. Convince them that they're wrong, because this is definitely sounding very wrong, assuming that the details in this article are accurate. Unfortunately, so far, Wizards of the Coast hasn't reciprocated to any of the backlash or any of the feedback. Linda Codega, the journalist who exposed all of this, published the following tweet just today, a few hours ago, in fact. So Wizards D&D hasn't tweeted anything, sent out any PR, or posted at all since I first wrote about the full proposed OGL 1.1 on January 5th. I suspect we'll hear something this week, but the lack of a response is both discouraging and damaging. 10 years of goodwill built on the backs of scrolling further down, you'll find additional tweets. 10 years of goodwill built on the backs of 5th edition creators, many if not most of whom are on Twitter, Reddit, and YouTube watching all this speculation happen, going down the drain. Where will Wizards of the Coast turn for new talent when the new talent stops writing 5th edition supplements? So much of Dungeons & Dragons' success rides on community sentiment and community participation. And if you're discouraging community participation and creativity, that's going to hurt you, Wizards of the Coast, more than it's going to hurt a community that can get creative and just circumvent your OGL entirely. Linda continues, almost everyone who wrote for Radiant Citadel was part of or wrote for a third-party publisher before they got that contract from Wizards of the Coast. If you don't have the OGL 1.0, Wizards of the Coast will not only harm 3PP or third-party publishers, but will be harming itself in the long run. I cannot wait to see what Wizards says when they finally break their silence, and if their first post is how they're moving forward with the proposed OGL 1.1, Well, it's worth noting that already we're seeing organizations and creators move away from D&D after a report of this new OGL began to spread. Right here, Houndsong Games posted in response to Wizards of the Coast's apparent new incredibly destructive stance on the open game license, including attempts to retroactively destroy or legally jeopardize work done under previous editions of the OGL, Sea of Cinders will not be moving forward as a 5th edition D&D or any derivative project. Sea of Cinders will live on as a setting under our own in-house, made-from-scratch system called Relict RPG. This post does not mince words. This bluntly sucks, it reads right here. We're being forced to abandon many months of work and thousands of unpaid hours we put in on nights and weekends to get this far. But the alternative appears to be to immediately forfeit all rights to the setting, lore, writing, items, species, mechanics, artwork, all content we created to a billion-dollar corporation for the sake of being part of D&D and propping up a company that seems hell-bent on destroying the community that was the primary reason we chose to work under this system to begin with. No, we do not work with a gun to our head, and we sure as hell will not do it for Wizards of the Coast. Stuff like this is what's going to happen en masse if Wizards of the Coast decides to adopt an OGL that discourages and in some ways punishes the community for what they've helped foster here for the D&D and tabletop community. Other ways the community has been protesting is by posting a public letter, like this one right here, published on January 8th by a group of third-party publishers led by Mike Holick of Mage Hand Press. And if you go to opendnd.games, you'll find the following page in which you can read this whole open letter where they break down why all of this is so awful for the community. Nothing about this new license is open. It chokes the vibrant community that has flourished under the original license. No matter the creator, it locks everyone into a new contract that restricts their work, makes it mandatory to report their projects and revenues to Wizards of the Coast, and gives Wizards of the Coast the legal right to reproduce and resell creators' content without permission or compensation. The new license can also be modified with worse terms or terminated at any time without any recompense by creators. For the largest creators in the industry, they're imposing this tax. They call this behavior anti-competitive, monopolistic, designed to crush small businesses that collectively employ hundreds of designers, writers, and artists. Under this tax, it becomes impossible for creators to put books on game store shelves or run Kickstarters for large audiences. Even though this only affects some companies in the space, those targeted are still tiny compared to Wizards of the Coast, which made $1.3 billion in 2021. So on and so forth. I recommend you read this open letter. They talk about how virtual tabletops can no longer operate under this new license agreement, this open, quote-unquote, open game license. The letter states here, if this new license gains wide adoption, the tabletop industry will shrink to a fraction of its current size, shuttering the small businesses that populate your local cons and putting a stop to their creations. They don't mince their words here. Innovation in the gaming industry will evaporate. Your favorite games will be trapped in the past instead of being allowed to migrate to your phone, virtual reality, and beyond. Diversity in the industry will shrink away as projects from marginalized creators are effectively written out the future. And this open letter concludes by encouraging people to participate in this campaign. Our community deserves an open future if we want our favorite games to not only survive, but thrive. This isn't an opportunity to litigate and tinker with a new license, but to return to the values of open gaming. And then there's this apt metaphor at the end. Wizards of the Coast has shown that they are the dragon on top of the horde, willing to burn the thriving village if only to get a few more gold pieces. It's time for us to band together as adventurers to defend our village from the terrible worm. It's kind of like how Square Enix is behaving more like Shinra, ironically, the publishers of Final Fantasy VII, with the CEO's commitment to all the blockchain, crypto, NFT, metaverse, bullcrap. But yeah, suffice to say that there's been a lot of fervor and backlash and outcry and retaliation from the community, and for understandable reasons. The spirit of what made D&D what it is today is being lost to what very much is typical corporate greed. That's, again, assuming that the recent reports are true, and it seems likely that there is validity to them. Now, the fact that Wizards of the Coast has been so quiet is somewhat unnerving, but I think that also indicates that they have been seeing the backlash, and maybe they are reevaluating certain things, certain decisions. So to make sure that Wizards of the Coast gets the message, I think it's important to continue to be constructively vocal about the negative sentiment surrounding what seems like just an across-the-board worse OGL that doesn't deserve the O in the acronym. Doesn't deserve the word open in there because nothing about this really seems all that open. I'll keep you guys updated as all of this further develops. In the meantime, though, let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on the updated OGL based on the information that's out there right now. Share your comments below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.